Tatiana Schlossberg, JFK's 35-year-old granddaughter and daughter of Caroline Kennedy, has died.
She was born into Camelot, draped in privilege, adored by a nation, the cherished daughter of America's most glamorous president. But behind that composed smile and that famous name, Caroline Kennedy has lived a life that would break most people beyond repair. Father assassinated, uncle gunned down, mother gone, brother lost at sea, and now the cruelest blow of all. A daughter buried at just 35. At 68, Caroline's heartbreak has no end in sight. This is her story, the weight of a name, and the price she paid for it. Let's start where everything starts with Caroline Kennedy, with a name that opened every door and simultaneously slammed grief after grief right in her face. Born on November 27, 1957 in New York City, Caroline Bouvier Kennedy entered the world as the first child of Senator John F. Kennedy and the impossibly stylish Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. From her very first breath, she wasn't just a little girl. She was a symbol, a piece of living American mythology. When her father won the presidency in 1960, 3-year-old Caroline moved into the White House. And honestly, for a hot minute, it was magic. She had a kindergarten set up on the 3rd floor. She had a pet pony named Macaroni. She had the entire world watching her with wide, adoring eyes. The press went absolutely wild for this gap-toothed, curious little girl toddling through the halls of the most powerful house in the world. But here's the thing about the Kennedy name. It giveth and it taketh away hard. On November 22, 1963, everything changed. Caroline was 5 years old, just 5 days shy of her 6th birthday, when her father was assassinated by a sniper bullet in Dallas, Texas. In a single afternoon, the most powerful man in her world was gone. The image that followed haunts history to this day. Little Caroline hand in hand with her mother, Jackie, watching her brother John Jr. raise his tiny fist in a salute to his father's flag-draped coffin. It is one of the most devastating photographs ever taken, a child dressed in pale blue saying goodbye to her daddy in front of the entire world. She never really got to grieve in private. She never had that option. The Kennedys were America's royal family, and their pain was always public. Within 2 weeks, Jackie packed up the children and left the White House. But the weight of that name that came with them everywhere they went. And if you think losing her father at 5 was the worst Caroline Kennedy would ever face, oh, we're just getting started. She survived that unthinkable loss as a little girl. But what about the years that followed? Was there ever a period of peace for Caroline? Or was tragedy already lurking around the next corner? Loss after loss, the Kennedy curse comes for Caroline. The phrase Kennedy curse gets thrown around a lot. Sometimes it sounds dramatic. Sometimes it sounds like tabloid fodder, but when you actually sit down and look at what Caroline Kennedy has lived through, you start to wonder if it's something else entirely, something almost unbearable. Just 5 years after her father's assassination in June 1968, Caroline lost her beloved Uncle Bobby. Robert F. Kennedy, the man who had become something of a father figure to her, who had stepped in to help fill that devastating void, was shot dead the very night he won the California Democratic primary. Another assassin, another Kennedy, another open casket. Caroline was 10 years old. Then in 1968, her mother Jackie made a decision that shocked the world. She married Greek shipping tycoon Aristotle Onassis. For Caroline, it was complicated. Her mother needed security, needed to escape the relentless glare of American public life. But marrying a man so wildly different from her father, it was a rupture of sorts in the fairy tale people had built around the Kennedy family. Caroline handled it with the quiet dignity she'd already learned was expected of her. For a stretch in the 1970s, Caroline tried to just live. She studied at Radcliffe College, earned her law degree from Columbia University, and in 1968, she married Edwin Schloberg, an interactive designer and author, in a ceremony that felt finally like something purely joyful. They would go on to have 3 children, Rose, Tatiana, and Jack. For a moment, it seemed like Caroline had carved out something beautiful on the other side of all that pain. But the curse wasn't done. In 1994, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the iconic, fiercely protective mother who had shielded her children as best she could, was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She was gone by May that same year, at just 64 years old. Caroline had now lost both parents. And then, as if the universe hadn't already taken enough, 1999 arrived. On July 16, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr., his wife Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, and her sister Lauren Bessette boarded a small plane. JFK Jr. was at the controls. They were heading to Martha's Vineyard for a cousin's wedding. The plane went down into the Atlantic Ocean. All three were killed. John was 38 years old. Caroline, the last surviving member of JFK's immediate family, had lost her only sibling, her partner in grief, the one person who had shared every loss she'd ever known. A Kennedy historian later put it with crushing simplicity. When you think about the losses Caroline has suffered, it was only John that had suffered the same. And then she lost John. She was 41 years old, and she had now outlived her father, her mother, and her brother. She was the last one standing. But even in the wreckage of all that grief, Caroline Kennedy didn't collapse. She rebuilt. She pursued a career, served her country, and became something remarkable in her own right. So what did she build? And was it enough to hold the darkness at bay? The woman she became, Caroline steps into the light. Here's something that often gets lost in all the tragedy talk. Caroline Kennedy is genuinely impressively accomplished, and that matters because it speaks to a woman who refused to be defined entirely by her pain. After earning her law degree from Columbia, she worked as a researcher at the Museum of Modern Art, then pivoted to writing and education reform. She co-authored multiple books, including works on the Constitution and civil liberties. She served as an advisor at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. She helped create the Profile in Courage Award in 1989, named after her father's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, an annual honor recognizing extraordinary acts of political bravery. She was, in short, doing the work of keeping her father's legacy alive, while also quietly, determinedly building her own. In 2008, Caroline made headlines when she publicly endorsed Barack Obama for president, calling him the leader most reminiscent of her father. That endorsement carried enormous symbolic weight, and it worked. She later co-chaired Obama's Vice Presidential Search Committee and played a key role in his re-election campaign in 2012. Then, in 2013, President Obama appointed Caroline Kennedy as U.S. Ambassador to Japan, making her the first woman ever to hold that position. She served with distinction until 2017, attending solemn ceremonies for atomic bomb victims at Hiroshima, strengthening military alliances, and proving that the Kennedy name could still stand for something on the world stage. In 2022, President Biden tapped her again, this time as U.S. Ambassador to Australia. She served until late 2024, focusing on climate change, Pacific security, and Indo-Pacific alliances. She was a diplomat in every sense of the word, precise, measured, powerful, and yet life kept interrupting. In early 2025, even as she was winding down her ambassadorial duties, Caroline found herself in a very public family war, one that tested her restraint and her convictions in ways even the diplomatic world never could. She'd faced assassinations, plane crashes, cancer, and grief upon grief. But nothing quite prepared the world for the Kennedy family feud that exploded into the open, and the venom Caroline unleashed at her own cousin. The Kennedy family feud, Caroline versus RFK Jr., if you thought the Kennedy family was all unity and shared grief, think again. Because in early 2025, Caroline Kennedy went off in a way that genuinely stunned the world. Her cousin Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had spent years building a platform around anti-vaccine conspiracy theories and fringe health claims. When President-elect Donald Trump nominated RFK Jr. to lead the Department of Health and Human Services in late 2024, Caroline Kennedy, who'd spent a career being measured and restrained and diplomatic, absolutely lost it. On January 28, 2025, just hours before her cousin's Senate confirmation hearing, Caroline published a devastating open letter. Her son Jack posted a video of her reading it to social media, and the internet went completely feral. She called RFK Jr. a predator. She said he was unqualified to lead the nation's health agencies. She accused him of vaccinating his own children while publicly discouraging other parents from doing the same. She claimed he had encouraged siblings and cousins down the path of substance abuse when they were young. She said she found his behavior egregious, and then she went somewhere even deeper. Bobby continues to grandstand off my father's assassination and that of his own father. She wrote, "It's incomprehensible to me that someone who is willing to exploit their own painful family tragedies for publicity would be put in charge of America's life and death situations." That line hit like a thunderclap. Here was Caroline Kennedy, who had never ever traded on her grief, who had spent decades quietly carrying the weight of her father's murder, calling out a man who, in her view, was weaponizing the same tragedy for personal gain. She also said that both her father and Uncle Bobby would be disgusted by what her cousin had become. It was extraordinary. The most private Kennedy, the one who had spent her entire life avoiding exactly this kind of messy public spectacle, had drawn a hard, bright line. And she had drawn it in the middle of an already personally devastating time. Because while this was all playing out, something far darker was unfolding inside her own family. The political war with her cousin was bitter and very public. But behind closed doors, Caroline was already fighting an entirely different kind of battle. One that no amount of diplomacy or public dignity could prepare her for. The beginning of the end. Tatiana's diagnosis. This is the part of Caroline's story that hurts the most. The part that feels unbearably unfair, even for a woman who has spent her life surrounded by loss. Tatiana Kennedy Schloberg was Caroline's middle child, a gifted environmental journalist and author whose work focused on climate change and public health. Friends and colleagues often described her as thoughtful, principled, and quietly determined. In many ways, she seemed to reflect the best qualities of her mother. In May 2024, Tatiana welcomed her second child, a daughter. She and her husband George Moran were already raising a young son, and life appeared full of promise. Then everything changed. During childbirth, Tatiana was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia, an aggressive and rare blood cancer. Doctors discovered she carried inversion 3, one of the disease's most difficult mutations to treat. She was just 34 years old, and her newborn daughter was only days old. For more than a year, Tatiana fought through intensive treatments. Throughout that battle, Caroline Kennedy and her husband, Edwin Schloberg, reportedly spent countless days at hospitals while helping care for their grandchildren. They were supporting their daughter through the fight of her life while helping raise her children at the same time. In November 2025, Tatiana shared her story publicly in a deeply personal essay for The New Yorker titled A Battle with My Blood. In it, she revealed her diagnosis, her fears, and the painful reality of her prognosis. She reflected on how she had always tried to protect her mother from pain and expressed heartbreak that her illness had become another tragedy for a family already marked by so much loss. She also wrote about the extraordinary support of her parents and siblings, explaining that they had spent nearly every day by her side and helped care for her children throughout her illness. On December 30th, 2025, Tatiana Kennedy Schloberg died. At age 35, she left behind her husband and their 2 young children. For Caroline Kennedy, it was another unimaginable loss. After burying her father, uncle, mother, and brother, she now faced the grief of burying her own child. 5 months later, the world would finally hear her speak about it. Early Life Revisited. The little girl who learned to carry the world. To understand Caroline Kennedy at 68, you have to go back to the beginning, to the little girl who learned early what it meant to be a Kennedy. She grew up in the White House, but loss entered her life long before the assassination that would define her childhood. Her mother, Jackie Kennedy, endured miscarriages, and in August 1963, Caroline's baby brother, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, was born prematurely and died just 2 days later. Caroline was only 5 years old. She had already witnessed her parents' heartbreak before facing the loss of her father. There was joy in those early years, too. She had a pony named Macaroni, attended a kindergarten setup inside the White House, and shared a close bond with her father. President John F. Kennedy was deeply devoted to his daughter. The famous photographs of Caroline playing beneath the resolute desk weren't carefully staged moments. They reflected everyday life in the Kennedy White House. Then came November 22, 1963. Losing a parent is devastating. Losing one in such a public and violent way is something else entirely. Caroline's grief became intertwined with the nation's grief. Every anniversary, documentary, museum exhibit, and election season brought renewed attention to a tragedy she could never fully escape. She learned early how to remain composed. Careful words, controlled emotions, dignified public appearances, those became essential survival tools. For decades, she carried herself with a grace forged under extraordinary pressure. In 1986, she married Edwin Schloberg, a designer and intellectual who lived far outside the usual Kennedy spotlight. Together, they built a remarkably stable life. In a family often associated with public drama, their nearly 4-decade marriage has stood out for its quiet strength and consistency. Friends and historians have often noted that Jackie Kennedy's approach to motherhood, protecting her children and preserving as much normality as possible, became Caroline's model as a parent. Now, after losing Tatiana, that lesson has taken on new meaning. A family friend told People that Caroline was drawing on the same example her mother set decades ago, helping her grandchildren remember their mother while guiding them through unimaginable loss. She's followed that playbook before, and somehow she is following it again. Breaking her silence, and what comes next? 5 months. That's how long Caroline Kennedy stayed silent after burying her daughter. No public statements, no interviews, no Instagram posts, just private shattering grief. The kind she has always carried behind closed doors. The kind this family has been carrying for 60 years. And then on Sunday, May 31st, 2026, she walked to a podium at the annual John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Awards ceremony in Boston, an event she had helped create at the library built in her father's name. And she spoke. She began with gratitude. She thanked family members for keeping her father's spirit alive. She held it together through the early parts of her remarks. And then she reached the moment she'd come to say, fighting back tears, her voice wavering in a way that stopped the room cold. Caroline Kennedy spoke publicly about her daughter for the first time since Tatiana's death. She told the audience that Tatiana had served on the board of the library and had embodied the values her parents stood for throughout her beautiful, remarkable, and tragically short life. The room erupted in applause. Caroline gathered herself, thanked the audience, and continued. Those were her first public words about her daughter. Careful, loving, restrained, and utterly heartbreaking. The memorial service had been held in January at St. Ignatius Loyola Church on New York's Upper East Side, attended by the family, including Caroline's son, Jack Schloberg. A new generation of Kennedys present in the wreckage, standing beside her. And Caroline, she is 68 years old. She has buried her father, her uncle, her mother, her brother, and now her daughter. She is raising her grandchildren with the same quiet ferocity that Jackie raised her. She is showing up. She is enduring. Presidential historian Stephen M. Gillen, who has spent his career studying this family, put simply, for Caroline, it's a series of horrible personal tragedies that lead up to what may be the hardest of them all. The hardest of them all. For a woman who lost her father before she turned 6, that sentence lands with the full, unbearable weight of everything. Neil Diamond once wrote a song called Sweet Caroline, reportedly inspired by a photograph of her as a young girl riding a horse. That little girl in the photograph had no idea what was coming. No idea that her life would become a masterclass in carrying impossible weight with impossible grace. At 68, Caroline Kennedy is still carrying it. And somehow, heartbreakingly, she is still standing. If Caroline Kennedy's story taught us anything, it's that some people are handed a burden so heavy that it would flatten the rest of us, and they carry it anyway, quietly year after year. What an extraordinary, devastating, resilient woman. If this video moved you, hit like, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because up next, we're diving into another public figure whose private heartbreak will absolutely floor you.